It's 1864, and the Civil War has been rolling along for many years. Two major armies have collided at a crossroads at a place called Cold Harbor. And once again, thousands of lives are about to be changed, and some lost. For one man, this is nothing new. William Pratt's a young man out here, but he's an officer in charge of a lot of other men. And he's a veteran of the 8th Connecticut. That's where we're at today. We're at Cold Harbor. We're at some of the places in and around Hanover County right now. Not the national battlefield, but other specific spots where fighting took place. And we're going to talk about William. Now it's a beautiful day out here in Cold Harbor. And you can't tell by the sounds on a battlefield like this just exactly what took place. The fighting out here was unmeasurable. And it would be many years before Americans that fought here would even hear of tales of fights that were close to what they could imagine out here. World War I, some of the fighting that took place there was comparable to the fighting at Cold Harbor. Just an amazing place. Now, William Pratt was born December 12th of 1837. And he came into this world in a family that was well-to-do. His mother Lydia and his father Julius had a very successful business. Now, they dealt in things like cutlery and ivory. And they made a lot of money doing that. As a matter of fact, his father's business actually created an ivory cane for John Quincy Adams. That ivory cane was presented to him. So you can imagine a man with that kind of business and influence. He's probably well off. Well, it reflects in the records of Mr. Pratt himself, William, because he was a graduate of a very expensive college in New York. After college, William, looking to be a part of his father's business, moves on, and he goes to South Africa on a venture for his father to seek out more locations for ivory, to expand the business, if you will. He does this in 1857. And this is right before those couple of years leading up to the American Civil War. Now, if you're a father thinking about your son, that's almost perfect timing, because when the American Civil War starts to boil over, his son he's going to be in another country, another continent even, but his son has a different idea. Now, in and around Cold Harbor and many of the places out here in the land areas, you can find stuff just like this right here. This is a rifle pit. This is a place where soldiers would have gotten down inside this pit to protect themselves as they were on picket duty or forward deployed or advance of their units. And the Confederates would have been off in that direction. Just off in that direction over there is where the actual national park is. They're lying low down in these pits. Now, I don't know if this is an original pit or if it's been dug out many years later to accentuate its size, but dotted all the way up and down this area over here are small divots in the ground that look like rifle pits. It's pretty amazing, these areas that are preserved out here in Virginia. Now, before the war, William Pratt's father, Julius, is a very outspoken man, very influential in his town, extremely wealthy, and he is also an abolitionist. Now, in 1857, 58, and 59, William's father is just like many of the other men that are over here in the United States at that time, speaking for abolition of slavery, and also basically saying that if it costs lives and if war is required, then that's what's required. He's all for it. He's beating the drum. Nobody leading up to the firing on Fort Sumter really thinks that it's going to come to that 100%. They don't want it to happen. They don't want people to die, but at the same time, they're willing to go to war for what they believe in. At least that's what he says. When war breaks out, Julius begs and pleads his son not to come back to the United States. He begs him to stay where he's at. It's because he doesn't want him to go to war. And he's got all the money in the world to pay for him to not go to harm's way. But all of Julius's money couldn't stop his son. In May of 1861, his son comes back to the United States with the intentions of enlisting in the army. And for that reason, this wealthy man, who is an ardent abolitionist, outwardly very outspoken, and thumping the war drum prior to this, knowing that this was going to get other people killed, knowing that war was coming, is now talking about disowning his son for wanting to take part in this war. I don't know if you can tell this by looking at the video or not, but underneath this log here is a pit that goes underneath there. Now, this is a circular pit. It's still pretty deep, even today. And this is a typical pit of a sharpshooter. And in the vicinity of this area, sharpshooters would have been placed trying to pick off Confederate soldiers off in this direction towards Cold Harbor and the defense works of the Confederacy. William, whose mother probably had a lot of influence on him when he came back to the States, he didn't enlist until April 22nd of 1862. And one can assume that the reason why was because his mother actually died about 3 weeks prior to that. Once she was out of the picture, it was fair game, and the young man decided to enlist. At the time that he was at the Battle of Antietam, he was only 24 years of age. And again, he was a wealthy young man. His family had plenty of money, and he had plenty of opportunity to back out and not go to war if he wanted to. But still, something drove him to do it. And some say that maybe even his own DNA might have driven him to do it, because his grandfather was Phineas. Phineas was an engineer for the first combat submarine, the Turtle. It's a very interesting background. Now, from time to time when I come out to these fields, whether it's a national park or a site exhibit from the Civil War trails, or land that the American Battlefield Trust has preserved, or even some of the other trusts like the Central Virginia Battlefield Trust, I run into sections and places of land where the feel is different. It's kind of dark, and it's not just the shade that you're in. And even then, smells are different. The field, even 160 years after a battle, have a different smell to it. It's kind of odd. And it could be all of the undergrowth that creates that smell, but I can't help but think that something's left behind in these fields, whether it be energy or what have you, from all those soldiers that had to suffer out here. September 17th, 1862. For any historian or fan of the history of the American Civil War, it's a date that'll live in infamy. Antietam was underway. The 8th Connecticut was just on the other side of that Burnside Bridge. While they're out there, a young man pops his head up over a hill, and he takes a look at the enemy. He wants to see what's going on. And with that, he ends up drawing a 12-pound shot towards their position. Well, as a result, a shell goes off amongst the ranks, and almost immediately ends up killing Corporal Marsh. Well, right next to Corporal Marsh is his lieutenant. The explosion splatters the man, hits the dirt, and kicks that dirt and blood up onto the lieutenant. It was so bad that they thought the lieutenant was badly injured. And then one of the other men noticed that on the hand of William Pratt, the skin had been removed from one of his knuckles. It was a flesh wound, and he got lucky. And he himself didn't even know how it happened. He guessed that it could have been a bullet or a piece of the shell when it went off. But he had to fight through that pain, regardless. It's now about 1 p.m. and the 8th Connecticut, along with other units, are now moved off towards Snavely's Ford. And they're crossing over Snavely's Ford. They get to the other side, and the 8th tries to take some cover. At that time, William has a very young man's thought go through his head. He realizes, in his words, that Uncle Sam only provided 4 crackers for him for lunch that day. So he's hungry. It's in the middle of combat. It's one of the worst fights, the single bloodiest day in American combat. And he's worried about his crackers. So I'm assuming this young man reached into his sack and grabbed a cracker out and had a bite to eat while he was sitting there resting under the shade of that hill, hoping to not get hit by a projectile as it's coming overhead. And he does describe the lobbing of shells going back and forth while they're waiting their fate. At about 3 p.m., the 8th Connecticut, the 16th Connecticut, and the 4th Rhode Island are supposed to move in concert together across an open field and try to cut off the route of the rebels in Antietam. Well, the 16th is a new unit coming out of Connecticut. They're not really that tested. And they're going into this fight with the 4th, which has had some fights up until this point, or with the 8th, which has had fights up until this point. Plenty of them. And as they're going across this field, the 8th gets disconnected from its line. It's far forward from the 16th, and they can see the 16th is completely separated from where they're at. The 16th, as a result, ends up getting smashed by AP Hill, and they get driven all the way back to Antietam Creek. And that puts the 8th in a very bad predicament. Being out near John Otto's cornfield, coming up over a ridge, the 8th sees a battery that they can attack. Company K, which happens to be the same company that Pratt is in, decides they're going to go after this. And while yelling now for Meriden, they go after this battery, and they are hit on their flanks, and they're hit from the rear, and they are shot at from the front. It's almost like they're completely surrounded. And these men are taking wound after wound. Just as Pratt gets up on the top of a fence rail and starts to head towards that battery, he's hit in the thigh by a bullet. And he describes it as feeling like a bone-crushing or bone-cracking sensation. And he can't put any weight on it. And he falls down flat on his face there in that field in front of that battery. Hopefully you can see this out front, but right out here, running in this direction, that's some of the defense works here at Cold Harbor. And placed directly out front of there is where a battery would have been for the Union Army. It's still very well intact. It's overgrown, obviously. There's a lot of trees growing into it, but it's still a pretty amazing spot to take a look at. And again, you come out to some of these fields out here in and around the area, you find stuff just like this. So now one of his men, one of his fellow soldiers, falls right there beside him. And William Pratt is looking at the soldier that's right in front of him. This soldier is not wounded. He's just laying down to take cover. William is wounded pretty bad, and he's worried he's going to bleed to death. And just as he gets that thought crossing his mind, AP Hill's men, a large swath of Confederate soldiers, start to make that big push. He can hear the screaming and the yelling of the Confederate soldiers all around him. The rebel yell is ringing out in Antietam, and it's loud. The thunderous sounds of hundreds, if not thousands of feet are just tromping all around him. And they run right over top of his position, and they're running off in the other direction. And they can hear that sound moving, along with the sounds of the rifles, the guns, and the soldiers down towards Antietam Creek. Well, then a rebel soldier comes up from behind and grabs him. And he grabs the other soldiers who are laying on the field that seem to be able to be helped up. Now William Pratt is official prisoner of war, and he's headed back towards the Confederate lines. The ones that are in good shape are going back to be shipped off for Confederate prisoner of war camps for exchange later on. But the ones like Pratt are going to end up inside of a barn. And hopefully the surgeons in those Southern forces can help save their lives. So now Pratt, who's kind of sick of having a bullet in his thigh, who's been waiting in this barn forever, decides he's going to try to take his own knife and pull that bullet out of his thigh. But then he starts begging and pleading with other people. Can you find me a surgeon? Can you find me somebody to help me? And all the while, he has the mindset to be able to take in everything that's going on around him. And in later years, he describes the sounds and sights and smells of what it would be like to be inside of one of those barns at Antietam when there are probably hundreds of men laying inside, some of them who are in the last throes of life, that are dying in front of him. Blood is all over the ground. The surgeons with their crude tools are probing and cutting as best as they can to try to save lives. And a lot of men in there are being maimed and cut to pieces. He describes one Confederate soldier as having all 4 limbs cut off. If you can imagine that. You go into a fight, you get wounded, and your own surgeon, in order to save your life, is cutting off your limbs. Well, one of those surgeons, who a Union Army surgeon called a butcher, came in and helped him out. He probed for the bullet, which was deep in the thigh, and then he made an 11-inch cut on his thigh. He gets down and he plucks the bullet out, which apparently was extremely flat. And he's able to remove that bullet for him just like he wanted. So now with the bullet out of his thigh and he's stitched up, that Union officer comes over and takes a look at his wound, tries to give him aftercare. And this, of course, is after the Confederate soldiers have already moved across the river and the Union has taken control of Antietam and Sharpsburg. And he takes a look at the wound and he tells the man, "You're lucky to be alive." Because he said that the cut was so deep and in such a bad place that he could have hit the femoral artery, and that soldier, William Pratt, would have bled out there at Antietam and would have been another death for the Battle of Antietam because of the terrible care that he received. This is pretty amazing. It makes you wonder how many men out there in those fields actually died because of the improper care that was given to them by the surgeons that were poorly trained. And one thing's for sure about Hanover County and many places in Virginia: more than just one event took place here at this location. This isn't just the Battle of Cold Harbor that's out here in all these fields surrounding these farms. In this area here, men from General Jackson's army lined up and headed towards Gaines Mill and was moving off in this direction. It's pretty amazing to think. And then you move a couple years later, and in 1864, men from Grant's army is headed in that direction towards Confederate soldiers who are now defending the position that's directly in front of Gaines Mill. It's really amazing the amount of history, the type of fighting that happened just within a few short years. Well, the young man that was in front of William Pratt, he wasn't wounded, so he was actually taken off to a prisoner of war camp. And that was the man that he had actually given his final words to in case he died. So I guess lucky for him that he didn't die there in Antietam. Fast forward, and William Pratt is now a respectable man in the 8th Connecticut, and he's starting to rise through the ranks. By the time 1863 comes around, he's now an adjutant. By the time the war's over, he becomes a major, and he musters out in 1865. But Antietam's not the last fight for him. That's why we're here in Cold Harbor. He's a major part of it. Everything leads us to here. That church right there in the background. That's Beulah Church. Now, you don't see it today, but out in these fields, stretching all the way out behind me there, all the way across in this direction, the Union Army was cooking up something big. This was the 1st of June in 1864 we're talking about. They'd come out here to fight. The 8th Connecticut is out here in these fields, along with the 2nd Connecticut Artillery as well. William Pratt's men are here to fight. That day, they kind of bruise up almost all day, until they finally get about 30,000 men out here in these fields. And then it happens. They step off in that direction in front of me there, and they attack. And that opens up a world of hurt out here at Cold Harbor. These men go back and forth. And this isn't just a quick affair. This isn't a couple of days or something like that that happens out here in these fields. This is something that happens for quite some time. The fighting continues on and on from about the 31st of May on. And then eventually, just like everybody else, the 8th Connecticut has to push off and go towards Petersburg. And that's where the siege starts to take place and the eventual end of the American Civil War. Now, the cost out here in lives lost at Cold Harbor for 8th Connecticut is about 8 killed and 30 wounded. In the grand scheme of things, considering what that unit's been through throughout the entire Civil War, that's not that big of a deal. It's not that many lives lost compared to what has happened in the past, but it's still more men gone. William Pratt moves on with his life, and in May of 1865, he finally musters out of the Union Army, and he moves on. He inherits the business from his father, inherits all the money, and in 1870, because of that wound that's in his body, he's been told by his physician that he would probably be better served if he ends up moving out west. And so he does. He moves out to Mankato, Minnesota. He goes out there and he builds a nice house overlooking the valley. And he has a very successful furniture making business out there. But then a locust infestation hits and kills the farms out there, and it tanks him. It pretty much kills his entire business. So William has to move on. Later on in life, he ends up going into the Dakota Hills for the gold rush that's happening there. He doesn't really quite hit the success that he had in the 1870s with that furniture business. And later, he becomes a citizen of the state of North Carolina. And then he eventually dies at the age of 90 in New York. His story is just like a lot of other stories out here on these fields in Virginia, in Antietam, Pennsylvania, and many other places like it. It's not just one story that happens in one location. Antietam is the dramatic backdrop for one of his biggest moments. Really, the moment that almost cost him his life. But his entire story spreads out across the American Civil War. And it connects him here to the Battle of Cold Harbor. It's pretty amazing. Well, I hope you've enjoyed walking these fields with us, going to all these side attractions out here at Cold Harbor. Now remember, the National Battlefield is only a small portion of the battlefield itself. Many farm fields like the one that's right behind me here were also part of that battle. Get out there on the trails, check it out for yourself. Until next time, this is History of Waffles.